The gunshot echoed across the barren landscape, shattering the night's silence like glass against stone. Luna Nightfeather ran through the darkness, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the wound in her side burning with each step. Behind her, voices called out angry, determined. Hunting. She clutched a weathered leather pouch to her chest, more precious than her own life. Blood dripped from her side, marking the path she took across the rocky terrain covered in fresh snow. Flashes of memory pierced her mind like lightning bolts. Her husband Marcus beaten to death with a pickaxe handle before her eyes. His final gaze locked on hers as life left him. The cabin ransacked, furniture destroyed, 3 men demanding gold she didn't know existed. Colonel Wade Blackwood himself had stood in the doorway, his pale eyes cold as winter ice, watching his men work Marcus over with methodical precision. Captain Morrison, the scarred man with dead eyes, had taken particular pleasure in breaking her husband's fingers one by one. "Where is it, Sullivan?" Morrison had growled, his voice like gravel in a tin can. "The map to the Sacred Valley. We know you found it." Marcus had said nothing, even when they shattered his ribs, even when they promised to do worse things to Luna than death. His silence had cost him his life, but it had given her the chance to escape with the ancient deer hide map hidden in the loft above their heads. The moon emerged from behind a cloud, bathing the Colorado mountains in silver light. Luna stumbled, her vision blurring from blood loss and exhaustion. In the distance, a lone structure stood against the night sky, a ranch house with a flickering light in the window. Her grandmother's voice whispered in the wind, urging her forward. "Run to the rising sun, daughter," the spirits seemed to say. "Sanctuary waits beyond the next ridge." With the last of her strength, Luna pushed toward the ranch. The pain in her side grew unbearable, darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. Behind her, the voices of pursuit grew fainter, but she knew they wouldn't give up. Not when Blackwood wanted the Sacred Valley badly enough to kill for it. As she reached the gate of the ranch, her legs gave way. The leather pouch fell beside her as she collapsed in the dirt, snow beginning to accumulate on her still form. Through fading consciousness, she saw worn boots approaching, heard the crunch of footsteps in snow. Then darkness took her completely. Above the ranch, a golden eagle circled despite the storm, its cry piercing the mountain air. In Apache tradition, eagles were messengers from the spirit world, guides for those lost in darkness. Luna's grandmother would have seen great significance in the bird's presence during such a desperate moment. But Luna was beyond seeing omens now, her consciousness fading as hypothermia began to claim her body. The leather pouch beside her contained more than just a map. It held the hopes of her people, the location of sacred springs that had healed the Apache for generations, and the key to saving her 9-year-old son Tommy from 3 years of captivity in Blackwood's compound. The eagle cried once more and disappeared into the swirling snow, leaving only the whisper of wind through pine boughs and the soft sound of approaching footsteps. Caleb Stone worked iron in the night when sleep wouldn't come. The rhythmic hammering drove away the demons, the nightmares, the faces of the dead. At 44, his body bore the scars of battles, both physical and spiritual, a testament to a life that had taken more than it had given. The forge's glow cast long shadows across his weathered face, highlighting the lines around his eyes that spoke of loss rather than laughter. The scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth told its own story of violence survived, though it was not the deepest wound he carried. He worked the metal with practiced precision, transforming raw iron into something useful, something with purpose, unlike the shapeless void his existence had become. 12 years had passed since he'd lost everything he'd once held dear. 12 years since the night that had stolen his wife Sarah and daughter Grace from the world, leaving him with nothing but guilt, rage, and the bitter taste of a god who seemed to take pleasure in destroying good things. The cabin around him reflected his state of mind. Built for defense rather than comfort, thick pine logs with narrow windows positioned to provide fields of fire in multiple directions. The barn stood separate, connected by a covered walkway that would protect anyone moving between buildings during an attack. This was the home of a man who understood that violence could visit without warning, who had prepared for it with the thoroughness of someone who had lost everything once and refused to be caught unprepared again. Caleb Stone had once been a family man and blacksmith in the small town of Cedar Falls, but that man had died the same night as his family, leaving behind only this hollow shell who spoke to no one, trusted nothing, and found peace only in the elemental simplicity of fire and iron. Around his neck, hidden beneath his rough wool shirt, hung an iron cross on a leather cord. Sarah had given it to him on their wedding day, a symbol of faith and love that had once meant everything. Now it was just metal and leather, as empty of meaning as his heart was empty of hope. Yet he couldn't bring himself to remove it, this last link to the man he used to be. The nightmares that drove him to work through the long winter nights were always the same. Sarah's voice calling his name as flames consumed their home. Grace's innocent eyes wide with terror as Apache raiders broke down their door. His own helpless rage as he arrived too late, finding only charred ruins and bodies burned beyond recognition. He had identified them by Sarah's wedding ring, found melted and twisted in the ashes. By a scrap of Grace's favorite dress, blue cotton with tiny yellow flowers that she'd insisted on wearing every Sunday to church. The Apache raid had been swift and merciless, leaving nothing but death and destruction in its wake. The sound that interrupted his work came again, a soft thud against the wooden fence that surrounded his property. Caleb set down his hammer and listened, his senses sharpened by years of solitary living. Not the wind, which had its own voice, not an animal which would have made multiple impacts. Something else, something human. He lifted the Winchester rifle from its rack beside the forge, checking the chamber with movements made automatic by repetition. 7 rounds in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. More than enough to handle whatever waited outside. Through the window he could see a dark shape beside his gate. Human, female, from the tea and the way she lay crumpled in the snow. His first instinct was suspicion. Ambushes weren't uncommon this far from civilization, and a woman in distress made excellent bait for drawing a man out of his defenses. But as he watched, snow began to accumulate on the still figure. No one would lie motionless in a blizzard as part of a deception. The cold would kill them before their trap could be sprung. Whatever had brought this woman to his gate, it wasn't a carefully planned ambush. Caleb grabbed his heavy coat and stepped into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving snow into his eyes and stealing his breath. The temperature had dropped at least 20 degrees since sunset, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. Anyone caught in the open wouldn't last much longer. The woman was unconscious but still breathing, her lips already taking on the blue tinge that warned of hypothermia. Apache, he realized as he knelt beside her, recognizing the bone structure of her face and the traditional beadwork on her clothing mixed with white settler garments. Blood matted her black hair and stained her wool coat, though the wound didn't appear immediately life-threatening. For a moment, old hatred rose in his throat like bile. Apache. The people who had destroyed his family, who had turned his world to and left him with nothing but emptiness and rage. It would be justice to leave her for the wolves, or put a bullet in her head to end her suffering quickly. His finger tensed on the rifle trigger, then slowly relaxed. Whatever her people had done, whatever crimes they had committed, he couldn't execute a helpless woman. That wasn't the man he was trying to become, even if he wasn't sure what kind of man that was anymore. Caleb lifted her carefully, surprised by how light she felt in his arms. Not the frailness of poor health, but the compact strength of someone who had lived their entire life outdoors. Her face, even slack with unconsciousness, held an intelligence that spoke of education and experience beyond what most reservation Apache received. Beside her in the snow lay a leather pouch, obviously important enough for her to have protected it even while unconscious. Caleb tucked it under his arm as he carried her toward the cabin. Whatever secrets it held could wait until she was warm and breathing normally. The familiar sense of his sanctuary enveloped them as he pushed through the door. Wood smoke from the fireplace, hot metal from the forge, and underlying it all, the smell of a man who lived alone and had forgotten the social graces that came with human companionship. He laid her on the wooden bench near the hearth, the same bench where he took his meals in solitude and read by firelight during the long winter evenings. The warmth began to work immediately, bringing color back to her lips and causing her breathing to deepen. As Caleb gathered clean rags, hot water, and whiskey for cleaning her wound, he found himself studying her face more closely. Late 20s, he estimated, with the kind of bone structure that suggested mixed heritage. Apache, certainly, but something else as well. Her clothing told a similar story, traditional moccasins and beadwork combined with a wool coat and denim pants that spoke of time spent in white settlements. This was no simple reservation woman, but someone who moved between worlds with the skill of a practiced survivor. The kind of person who would have information, connections, knowledge that might prove valuable or dangerous. The wound along her shoulder blade was a clean graze, probably from a rifle bullet that had come close enough to tear skin but missed anything vital. Recent, within the last few hours judging by the amount of blood, someone had been shooting at her, and recently. As he began cleaning the wound with whiskey and hot water, she stirred, her face contorting with pain. Dark eyes fluttered open, immediately alert despite her ordeal. No confusion, no disorientation, just instant awareness of her surroundings and the potential threat represented by the armed white man tending her injuries. "Easy," Caleb said quietly, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe. I'm not going to hurt you." Luna's eyes focused on the man leaning over her, taking in details with the trained observation of someone who had learned that survival often depended on reading people correctly. Tall, lean, weathered by years of mountain living. The scar along his jaw spoke of violence survived, while his careful movements suggested military training. But it was his eyes that held her attention. Gray as winter sky and haunted by ghosts she recognized from her own mirror. "Where am I?" she managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. "My ranch," he replied, continuing to clean her wound with gentle efficiency. "Found you collapsed at my gate. You've been shot." Luna tried to sit up, wincing as pain flared along her shoulder. The man made no move to help her, but he didn't try to stop her either. When she was upright, she noticed the leather pouch sitting on the wooden table where he could easily reach it, though he hadn't opened it. "Thank you," she said, meeting his gaze directly, "for helping me." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, setting down the bloody rag. "There were men following your trail, 3 of them on horseback. They'll be here soon enough." Fear clutched at her heart with icy fingers. Morrison and his men, still pursuing even through the blizzard. They would never give up, not when Blackwood wanted the sacred valley badly enough to torture and kill for it. "They killed my husband," she said, the words catching in her throat as the memory of Marcus's death flooded back. "Beat him to death with a pickaxe handle while I watched from the loft." The man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those gray eyes. Recognition of grief, perhaps, or understanding of what it meant to lose everything that mattered. "What did they want?" he asked. "Gold," they said. "Some map Marcus was supposed to have hidden." Luna closed her eyes, trying to block out the sound of bone cracking, wood splintering against flesh. "Thing is, my husband was an honest miner. We barely had enough to eat most winters." "People brag," the man said simply. "Say things to the wrong person at the wrong time. Word gets around." Luna nodded. Marcus had indeed talked big when he'd been drinking, spinning tales of striking it rich someday, buying her a house in Denver with running water and electric lights. But those had been dreams, nothing more than the hopes of a man trying to build a better life for his wife. She looked at the leather pouch, remembering how she'd grabbed it instinctively as she fled the cabin. "I took that when I ran. Maybe Marcus put something in it, maybe not, but they'll kill for it either way." The man stood and poured whiskey into a tin cup, handing it to her. She sipped it carefully, coughing as the liquor burned her throat and brought tears to her eyes. "They saw me run," Luna said, panic rising in her voice. "They'll track me here. You don't understand these men. Captain Morrison, the one with the broken nose and the scar across his face, he worked for us last spring, fixed our cabin roof. He knows this country better than anyone, knows where all the ranches are." "Then I reckon he knows me too," the man said, moving to the window to study the darkness beyond. "Name's Caleb Stone. Been up here long enough that most folks in these mountains have heard tell of me." Luna studied him more carefully, noting the way he held himself with the relaxed readiness of someone always prepared for violence. The rifle never far from his reach, the defensive positioning of the cabin's furniture, the narrow windows that provided good fields of fire while minimizing exposure. "You're not planning to fight them, are you?" she asked. Caleb looked out at the storm, watching snowflakes dance in the wind like tiny ghosts. "You got a better idea?" Luna considered their options. 3 armed men against 1, with her wounded and exhausted. The storm might slow pursuit, but it wouldn't stop men like Morrison entirely. They could wait here and be trapped when the attackers arrived, or venture into the blizzard and likely freeze to death before dawn. There's another way, Caleb said, moving a wooden barrel aside to reveal a trapdoor covered in dust and spider webs. Back in the war, we used to dig these behind enemy lines in case Confederate cavalry came through. Root cellar underneath, big enough for two, quiet enough to wait them out. Luna stared at the hidden space, recognizing it as a hiding place built by someone who understood that survival sometimes meant disappearing completely. You think they'll just search the cabin and leave? I think they'll tear the place apart looking for whatever's in that pouch. Question is whether they're willing to burn down a mountain man's cabin based on guesswork alone. Before Luna could respond, the request she'd been dreading to make became urgent. The sacred tobacco in her medicine bag called to her, demanding the ritual cleansing that Apache tradition required before any important undertaking. I need to ask something that might sound strange to you, she said carefully. My people have customs, spiritual practices that help protect us from danger. Would you allow me to perform a cleansing ceremony? It involves burning sacred tobacco and saying prayers. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. Superstition? Faith, Luna corrected gently, the same as when Christian people pray before battle. Something in her tone, or perhaps the comparison to his own abandoned faith, made Caleb nod slowly. Do what you need to do. Luna retrieved her medicine bag and removed a small bundle of sage and tobacco wrapped in red cloth. As she arranged the sacred plants in a shallow bowl, she began to speak in the Apache language, her voice low and musical in the harsh consonants and flowing vowels of her mother tongue. The smoke from the burning tobacco filled the cabin with an earthy, sweet scent unlike anything Caleb had ever experienced. Luna moved around this room with purposeful motions, waving the smoke into corners and along the walls, while continuing her chanted prayers. To his surprise, Caleb found the ritual soothing rather than alien. The rhythmic chanting, the aromatic smoke, the sense of ancient traditions being honored in this crude mountain cabin. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness in his chest. Not peace exactly, but the absence of the constant ache that had been his companion since Sarah and Grace died. What did you pray for? He asked when she finished. Protection for both of us, guidance from the spirits of this place, and wisdom to know when to fight and when to hide. Luna studied his face in the firelight, noting the way his expression had softened during the ceremony. You have wolf spirit, she said quietly, strong but wounded. Iron and fire call to you because they transform pain into strength. The observation hit closer to home than Caleb cared to admit. He had indeed found solace in his forge, in the simple process of heating metal until it glowed like captured sunlight, then shaping it into something useful with hammer blows that echoed like heartbeats. Your husband, Caleb said, changing the subject. What kind of map were they really looking for? Luna hesitated, then opened the leather pouch to reveal its contents. The ancient deer hide unfolded like a flower blooming in reverse, revealing intricate drawings and symbols that seemed to dance in the firelight. Apache words mixed with Spanish notations, creating a document that spoke of two cultures coming together in the pursuit of something sacred. This shows the way to a place my people call the Valley of Souls, Luna explained, tracing the route with her finger. Sacred ground where our ancestors are buried, where hot springs bubble up from deep in the earth. The minerals in the water can heal sickness, mend broken bones, cure the wasting disease that kills so many miners. Caleb studied the map carefully, recognizing some of the geographical features from his years in the mountains. And Blackwood wants to turn it into a mining operation. Worse than that, he wants to bottle the sacred water, sell it to rich people back east as miracle medicine. Turn holy ground into profit, destroy a burial site that has been protected for generations. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls, carrying with it the sound of hoofbeats growing closer. Time was running out. There's something else, Luna said, her voice barely audible above the storm. Something I haven't told you about why this matters so much to me. Caleb waited, recognizing the weight of confession in her tone. Marcus wasn't my first husband. I had a son, Tommy, from my previous marriage. He's 9 years old now. Tears began to flow down her cheeks, reflecting the firelight like liquid gold. 3 years ago, Blackwood's men raided our place up near Leadville. Killed my first husband. Took Tommy. Blackwood's been raising him as his ward ever since, filling his head with lies about Apache people, about his own mother. The revelation hit Caleb like a physical blow. This wasn't just about protecting sacred ground or preventing exploitation of holy sites. This was about a mother trying to save her child from the man who had destroyed her family. Outside, the storm was beginning to intensify. What had started as gentle snowfall was becoming a full blizzard, with winds strong enough to bend the pine trees and snow thick enough to reduce visibility to mere yards. Perfect weather for hiding or for hunting. Tommy probably doesn't even remember me anymore, Luna continued, her voice thick with anguish. Blackwood's had 3 years to poison his mind against everything Apache, everything that connects him to his heritage. He probably thinks of Blackwood as his real father now. Caleb found himself thinking of Grace, of how quickly children could adapt to new circumstances when their survival depended on it. A 9-year-old boy raised by the man who had killed his father would indeed learn to love his captor, especially if that captor provided comfort, security, and a convincing explanation for why his real family had been bad people. "Where is he now?" Caleb asked. "Fort Blackwood, the mining operation about 40 miles north of here. It's not really a fort, just a fortified compound where Blackwood runs his operation. Barracks for his men, processing facilities for ore, and living quarters where he keeps Tommy like a beloved pet." Luna's hands shook as she folded the map carefully, treating it with the reverence due a sacred object. "The worst part is, I'm not even sure Tommy would want to be rescued. Blackwood has probably convinced him that I abandoned him, that Apache people are savages who would hurt him." Caleb moved to the window, studying the swirling snow that was making the landscape outside increasingly invisible. In the distance, barely visible through the storm, he could see moving shadows that might be horsemen or might be wind-blown trees. Either way, they needed to make their decision quickly. "The Sacred Valley," he said. "How long would it take to reach it?" "In good weather with horses, maybe 5 days through the mountain passes. In this storm, on foot, assuming we don't freeze to death or fall off a cliff." Luna shrugged. "A week, maybe more." "And you think the springs there really have healing properties?" Luna's eyes flashed with something between anger and sadness. "My grandmother lived to be 93 years old without ever seeing a white doctor. She treated broken bones, fevers, the coughing sickness, even some cancers, all with water and plants from the Sacred Valley. When I was a girl, she took me there once, showed me the pools where the water bubbles up warm from deep underground. I watched her cure a man's infected leg wound just by soaking it in that water for 3 days." "But you don't believe anymore," Caleb observed, reading something in her expression. "I've lived too long in the white world, seen too many false promises and fake medicine shows. Part of me still believes, but part of me wonders if it was just hope, the power of believing something would work." Caleb understood that kind of doubt. He had once believed in a God who protected the innocent and answered the prayers of the faithful. That faith had died with Sarah and Grace, leaving behind only the empty rituals of a religion that no longer offered comfort. "If the water does have healing properties," he said slowly, "and Blackwood gets control of the valley, what happens to your people?" "The Apache lose their most sacred site, the place where we've buried our dead for centuries. The springs that have healed our people for generations become products sold to the highest bidder. And Blackwood becomes rich enough to buy politicians, judges, anyone who might try to stop him from taking more Apache land." Luna stood and moved to stand beside him at the window. "But that's not even the worst part. The worst part is that Tommy will grow up believing his mother's people are nothing but savages, that their sacred places deserve to be destroyed for profit. He'll become a weapon against his own heritage." In the distance, the eagle appeared again, its wings catching the wind as it watched their progress. Luna noticed it at the same time as Caleb, her breath catching in her throat. "Eagle in a blizzard," she murmured. "My grandmother would have said that was a spirit guide trying to tell us something important." Caleb found himself watching the bird with something approaching wonder. Eagles didn't normally fly in weather like this, didn't waste energy fighting wind and snow, unless driven by something more powerful than normal hunting instincts. "What would she have said it meant?" he asked. "That we're on the right path, even though it seems impossible. That we should trust in things we can't see or understand." Luna's voice grew stronger. that sometimes the spirits provide guidance when we need it most, even if we're not sure we believe anymore. The eagle cried once, a wild sound that cut through the wind like a blade, then began flying east toward the high peaks. Both Caleb and Luna felt compelled to follow its flight until it disappeared into the swirling snow. Decision time, Caleb said, hearing hoofbeats growing closer through the storm. We can try to reach your sacred valley, use it as sanctuary while we plan our next move. Or we can try to get your boy back first, though that would mean facing Blackwood's entire operation with just the two of us. Luna closed her eyes, weighing options that all seemed to lead to disaster. Rescue Tommy first, and they would be facing 40 armed men with no backup and no sanctuary to retreat to. Go to the Sacred Valley first, and Tommy would spend more weeks under Blackwood's influence, possibly becoming more convinced that his Apache heritage was something to be ashamed of. The valley, she decided finally. Tommy's survived 3 years with Blackwood. He can survive a few more weeks if it means having a safe place to take him afterward. Besides, she touched the map gently, there might be something there we'll need. Something that could help break whatever hold Blackwood has over my son. What kind of something? Truth, Luna said simply. The power of the sacred springs, if it's real, might be strong enough to heal more than just physical wounds. And if it's not real, if it's just wishful thinking and Apache superstition, then at least we'll know. At least I'll stop hoping for miracles that don't exist. The sound of hoofbeats was unmistakable now. 3 horses moving at a steady pace despite the storm. Professional riders who knew how to handle their mounts in difficult conditions, which meant Morrison and his men had military training in addition to their skills as trackers and killers. Caleb moved quickly around the cabin, extinguishing all the lamps except the one near the forge. Let the attackers think he was working late, unaware of their approach. The element of surprise might be their only advantage against 3 armed men. Can you use that? He asked, nodding toward the bow and quiver of arrows Luna had been carrying. I've been hunting with Apache bows since I was old enough to draw the string, she replied, testing the tension with experienced movements. But arrows against rifles. Arrows are silent. Rifles announce their position with every shot. Caleb checked his Winchester, confirming he had a full magazine plus 1 in the chamber. You take the back window, I'll cover the front. If they rush us, we make them pay for every foot of ground. Luna positioned herself where she could see the rear approach to the cabin while still maintaining cover behind the thick log walls. Her bow was a traditional Apache design, made from mountain mahogany and strung with sinew, capable of driving arrows through a man's chest at 50 yards. The hoofbeats stopped about 100 yards from the cabin, just at the edge of visibility in the storm. Smart tactics, keeping their distance while they evaluated the threat and planned their approach. These weren't random bandits or opportunistic killers, but men with military experience who understood the value of reconnaissance and planning. Stone, Morrison's voice carried clearly through the wind. We know the squaw is in there. Send her out with the map, and you can live to see another sunrise. Caleb's response was deliberately calm, the voice of a man unimpressed by threats. Nobody here but me and the wind, Morrison. Best keep riding before the storm gets worse. Funny thing, though, her blood trail leads right to your door. Now, why would a man lie about something so obvious? Maybe you should be sure whose blood you're following before you accuse someone of lying. There was a pause while Morrison conferred with his companions, their voices too low to carry over the wind. Luna used the time to offer a silent prayer to the mountain spirits, asking for protection and wisdom in the fight to come. Caleb found himself thinking of Sarah and Grace, wondering if their spirits might somehow be watching this confrontation. The thought should have brought comfort, but instead it filled him with a familiar ache. They had died because he hadn't been there to protect them. Would history repeat itself with this Apache woman who had stumbled into his life? Last chance, Stone, Morrison called out. We're coming in, whether you cooperate or not. Come ahead then, Caleb replied, but you'd better bring more than 3 men. The attack came from 2 directions simultaneously. Morrison and 1 companion approached the front of the cabin with rifles ready, while the 3rd man circled around to the rear where he could cover the back door and prevent escape. Professional tactics executed with military precision. Luna's first arrow took the rear attacker in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the snow. Her second arrow, loosed while he was still staggering from the first wound, caught him in the chest and dropped him instantly. Apache archery training emphasized quick, accurate shooting at close range, and Luna had been one of her uncle's best students. At the front of the cabin, Caleb's rifle spoke twice in rapid succession. His first shot shattered Morrison's left arm, sending the captain spinning behind the cover of a large pine tree. His second shot caught Morrison's companion center mass, dropping him face first into the snow, where he lay motionless. Morrison managed to return fire despite his wounded arm, his bullets splintering wood inches from Caleb's head. The former soldier was tough and experienced, not the kind of man to give up easily even when severely wounded. "You're bleeding out, Morrison," Caleb called through the storm. "Give it up." "Go to hell, Stone," came the reply, followed by another poorly aimed shot that went wide. Luna crept to the front window, her remaining arrows nocked and ready. Through the swirling snow, she could see Morrison's position behind the pine tree, blood staining the snow around him in dark patches that looked black in the dim light. "He's losing too much blood," she whispered to Caleb. "Few more minutes and shock will finish him." But Morrison had one more play left. Despite his wounds, he managed to crawl toward the cabin's front door, probably hoping to get close enough for a final desperate assault. His movements were slow and clumsy, leaving a clear trail in the snow. As he struggled to reach the porch, Luna stepped out the front door with her bow drawn. Morrison looked up to see an Apache arrow pointed at his heart, held steady in the hands of a woman whose dark eyes showed no mercy. "Easy," Morrison gasped, trying to bring his rifle around despite his wounded arm. "Don't move." "You killed my husband," Luna said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the storm. "Tortured him to death while I watched from the loft." Morrison's rifle wavered in his weakened grip. Blood loss was making his movements unsteady, his vision blurry. "Just business, squaw. Nothing personal." "It was personal to me." Luna's arrow took him through the heart, ending Captain Morrison's career of violence and intimidation in the snow outside Caleb Stone's cabin. He died still clutching his rifle, his eyes fixed on the storm clouds above. The silence that followed seemed to echo louder than the gunfire had. 3 men dead in the space of minutes, their blood already being covered by fresh snowfall. The storm was erasing the evidence of violence even as it continued to rage around the cabin. Caleb and Luna stood in the doorway, looking out at the carnage they had created together. Neither spoke for several minutes, both processing what had just happened and what it meant for their future. "Blackwood will send more men when these don't report back," Luna finally said. "How many men does he have?" "At the mining operation? Maybe 40 or 50, plus however many he can hire from the surrounding towns. More than enough to hunt us down if we stay in one place too long." Caleb nodded, already thinking tactically about their next moves. "Then we'd better not stay in one place. Gather whatever supplies you need. We leave for the sacred valley within the hour." As they prepared for the journey ahead, neither noticed the golden eagle that perched briefly on the cabin's roof before disappearing into the storm. But Luna felt its presence, a reminder that some things existed beyond the reach of bullets and violence, beyond the understanding of men like Blackwood and Morrison. The sacred valley waited somewhere ahead in the mountains, holding promises of healing, sanctuary, and perhaps the power to save a 9-year-old boy from the man who had stolen his identity along with his freedom. The storm continued to rage as they shouldered their packs and stepped out into the wilderness, 2 souls bound together by violence and loss, carrying with them an ancient map that might lead to salvation or destruction in the Colorado high country. Behind them, the cabin stood empty, its walls marked by bullet holes and its yards stained with blood that would soon be covered by snow. It had served its purpose as sanctuary and fortress, and now it became just another abandoned structure in a land where violence was as common as the changing seasons. The eagle cried once more from somewhere in the storm, its voice carrying a message of hope that neither Caleb nor Luna was quite ready to believe, but both desperately needed to hear as they began their journey into the heart of the mountains, toward a valley that existed somewhere between legend and reality, between faith and doubt, between the world that was dying and the world that might yet be born from its ashes. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and silence. 3 feet of fresh powder covered the landscape, turning familiar landmarks into strange, alien shapes that could deceive even experienced mountain travelers. The air was so cold it burned the lungs, and every breath emerged as a cloud of vapor that froze almost instantly. Caleb and Luna had been walking for 6 hours, following game trails that wound through stands of pine and aspen toward the high country where the sacred valley supposedly lay hidden. The going was slow and treacherous, with snow deep enough to swallow a man's leg to the knee and hidden rocks that could turn an ankle or send someone tumbling down a steep slope. Luna moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to walk in snow before she could properly walk on dry ground. Her Apache training showed in every step, the way she tested uncertain footing before committing her weight, how she read the subtle signs that indicated safe passage versus dangerous terrain. Caleb followed her lead, recognizing superior wilderness skills when he saw them. His own mountain experience was extensive, but it was the knowledge of a man who had learned survival through necessity and bitter experience. Luna's abilities came from generations of accumulated wisdom, passed down through countless winters. "How much farther to Eagle Rock?" Caleb asked during a brief rest beside a frozen stream. Luna consulted the deer-hide map, orienting herself by the distant peaks that rose like cathedral spires against the blue sky. "About 10 miles ahead, maybe 12. We'll need to climb another 1,000 feet before we can see it clearly." As they continued their ascent, Luna began sharing knowledge that had been passed down through her mother's family for generations. She showed Caleb how to identify plants that could provide emergency food even in winter, where to look for hidden springs that stayed unfrozen, how to read weather signs in animal behavior. "Your grandmother taught you all this?" Caleb asked as Luna pointed out a grove of aspen trees where the inner bark could be harvested for nutrition. "My grandmother, my mother, my aunts. Apache women are the keepers of survival knowledge." Luna's voice carried pride mixed with sadness. "Tommy should have been learning these things from me. Instead, he's probably sitting in Blackwood's compound, forgetting everything that connects him to his heritage." "Tell me about him," Caleb said as they navigated around a massive boulder. "What was Tommy like before?" Luna's face softened. "Curious about everything. He wanted to know how birds could fly, why snow was white, what made the stars shine. And brave, almost too brave sometimes. When he was 7, he tried to pet a bear cub because he thought it looked lonely. What happened? The mother bear chased him up a tree and kept him there for 3 hours. I found him still perched on a branch, grinning like it had been the greatest adventure of his life." Caleb smiled despite himself. "Sounds like he had good survival instincts." "Apache children learn early that the world is dangerous but beautiful. We teach them to respect the wilderness, not fear it." Luna paused to study wolf tracks in the snow. "Wolves are like people in many ways. They just want to live in peace and raise their families." "You mentioned wolf spirit before," Caleb said, remembering her comment during the tobacco ceremony. "What did you mean?" Luna studied his face carefully. "Apache people believe that every person has a connection to certain animals, spirit guides that share their nature. Some people have bear spirit, strong and protective. Others have eagle spirit, able to see far and soar above troubles. And wolf spirit means? Wolves are survivors. They're intelligent, loyal to their pack, fierce when protecting what they love. But they can also become isolated when tragedy strikes." Luna's voice grew gentle. "A wolf without a pack can forget how to trust, how to live for something beyond mere survival." The observation hit closer to home than Caleb cared to admit. How does a lone wolf find its way back? Sometimes another wolf finds it first. Shows it that trust is still possible, that there are things worth protecting beyond yourself. Their eyes met, and Caleb felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. Not just attraction, but recognition of a kindred spirit who had also survived loss and was still learning how to live with the scars. As the day wore on, they climbed steadily higher into increasingly dramatic terrain. Massive stone formations jutted from the snow like ancient monuments, and valleys stretched away into blue distance. The air grew thinner, making every breath an effort. During their second rest, Luna performed another brief ceremony with Sage, offering prayers for safe passage through the sacred mountains. This time, Caleb listened more carefully to her chanted words, beginning to appreciate the rhythm and beauty of the Apache language. "What are you asking for?" he inquired when she finished. "Permission from the mountain spirits to pass through their domain." protection from avalanches and storms, guidance when the way becomes unclear. Luna scattered the ashes on the wind, and wisdom to know the difference between what we can control and what we must accept. Do you believe the spirits actually listen? Luna considered the question seriously. I believe there are forces in the world larger than our understanding. Whether they're spirits or God or just accumulated wisdom of people who've lived here for thousands of years. She shrugged. Does it matter what we call them, as long as they help us find our way? Caleb found himself thinking about his abandoned faith, about the God he had once believed watched over his family. That belief had died with Sarah and Grace, leaving only emptiness and bitter questions. But there was something different about Luna's spirituality, something less rigid and more practical than the Christianity he had known. Her prayers seemed less like demands for divine intervention and more like expressions of humility before forces beyond human control. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they reached a high ridge that provided their first clear view of Eagle Rock. The formation was unmistakable, a massive stone spire that resembled a giant bird of prey with wings spread wide. Even from several miles away, its size was impressive, rising at least 500 feet above the surrounding peaks. There, Luna said, pointing to smaller formations near the base. Those are the 3 standing stones that mark the approach to the sacred valley. We should reach them tomorrow evening if we maintain this pace. Caleb studied the terrain ahead through his spyglass. The route would take them through increasingly difficult country, including at least one pass that looked narrow enough to be blocked by a single rock slide. Blackwood's men, he said. Any chance they know about this route? Morrison might have figured out our destination, but he's dead. The others don't know these mountains well enough. Luna's confidence wavered slightly. At least, I hope they don't. They made camp that evening in a sheltered grove of pine trees, building a small fire that would provide warmth without creating enough smoke to signal their location. Luna demonstrated how to construct a Dakota fire hole, a technique that concealed flames below ground levels while burning efficiently. As darkness settled over the mountains, they shared a meal of dried meat and hardtack. The silence was comfortable, the companionship of 2 people who had learned that words weren't always necessary. Tell me about your family, Luna said eventually. What were they like? Caleb stared into the fire, watching flames dance among the kindling. For 12 years, he had avoided talking about Sarah and Grace, couldn't bear to speak their names or share memories that felt too precious and painful to expose. But something about Luna's presence made the words come easier than they had in over a decade. Sarah was a teacher before we married, he began quietly. She loved books, poetry especially, had a way of seeing beauty in places most folks overlooked. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. She used to say that was why she married me, said I had beauty hiding beneath all the rough edges. She sounds wise, Luna observed, wiser than I deserved. Caleb's gaze drifted to the stars overhead. Grace was sunshine in human form, curious about everything, never still for a moment. She'd be 16 now, almost a young woman. His voice roughened with emotion. All the years missed, the moments lost. If I close my eyes, I can still see her chasing fireflies while Sarah read stories on the porch. Luna reached across the fire and touched his hand briefly. What happened to them? Caleb took a shuddering breath. A Apache raid on the settlement where they were staying. I was away hunting, gone for a week. When I came back, the whole place was burned. I found them in the ruins, he continued, his voice barely audible. Burned beyond recognition, but I knew it was them from Sarah's wedding ring and a piece of Grace's dress. Luna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice held uncertainty. The ring, she said slowly. What did it look like? Silver band with turquoise inlay, traditional Navajo design that Sarah loved. Caleb's hand moved to the iron cross at his throat. Why? Luna's expression grew troubled. My father once told me about a raid that went wrong, where women and children died who weren't supposed to be harmed. He said one of the warriors tried to save a white woman and child, gave the woman his silver ring for safe passage. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. What are you saying? I'm saying that not all raids were what they seemed. Sometimes warriors acted without tribal approval. Luna leaned forward, her eyes intense. And sometimes the people found dead weren't the people who were actually killed. That's impossible. I buried them myself. Bodies burned beyond recognition could be anyone's, especially if someone wanted you to believe they were dead. Luna's voice grew urgent. Caleb, what if your family escaped? What if someone helped them get away? The possibility was too enormous to contemplate. Caleb had built his entire identity around their loss, had defined himself by grief for over a decade. No, he said firmly, I can't let myself believe that. Hope is too dangerous when you have already lost everything once. But doubt began to creep into his certainty. The ring had been unusual, not Sarah's normal style, and he had never understood why she and Grace had been in that settlement, so far from their usual haunts. My father disappeared after that raid, Luna continued, was never seen again by our people. For all I know, he died trying to prevent the massacre. Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that made both freeze. Hoofbeats, distant but growing closer, coming from the direction they had traveled. Multiple horses moving carefully through the snow and darkness. Caleb and Luna exchanged a look of shared understanding. Blackwood's men, following their trail despite the difficulty of night tracking. Professional persistence that spoke of military training. How many? Luna whispered, her bow already in her hands. Caleb listened carefully. 4, maybe 5. More than we can handle directly. The fire? Too late to hide it completely. They've probably seen the glow. Luna was already moving, scattering the burning wood and covering coals with snow. Caleb gathered their packs and weapons, preparing for a fighting withdrawal through treacherous terrain. This way, Luna whispered, leading toward a steep slope that descended into a narrow canyon. If we can reach the bottom without being seen, we can follow the creek and lose them in the rocks. They began their descent, moving as quietly as possible through snow that crunched under every footstep. Behind them, voices could be heard calling through the darkness. Tracks lead up this way. Fresh fire, still warm. Can't be more than an hour ahead. Halfway down the slope, Luna's foot broke through ice that concealed a hidden stream. The freezing water soaked through her moccasin instantly, and she gasped despite her efforts to remain silent. Keep going, Caleb urged. We'll deal with frostbite later. They reached the canyon bottom as torchlights appeared on the ridge above. 5 riders, studying the trail that led into darkness where their quarry had disappeared. Split up, one called. Jenkins, take the north side. Williams, follow me down the main trail. Luna and Caleb crept along the creek bed, using running water to mask their movement, while staying below the sight lines of mounted pursuers. The canyon was narrow and winding, providing excellent cover as long as they avoided being silhouetted against snow patches. A rifle shot echoed off the canyon walls, followed by the whine of a ricochet. One searcher had spotted movement and was firing blind, hoping to flush out his targets. Move, Caleb hissed, and they abandoned stealth for speed, running through shallow creek while more gunshots rang out. Luna spotted a narrow cleft in the rock wall. There! They forced their way into the opening just as torchlight began probing where they had been hiding moments before. Lost them in the rocks, a frustrated voice called. Could have gone any direction. Keep looking. Blackwood's offering $1,000 for that map. The search continued for another hour, but the side canyon led to a maze of rock formations where horses couldn't travel. Eventually, the hunters gave up until daylight could reveal tracks. Luna and Caleb climbed steadily higher through increasingly difficult terrain, following game trails between towering stone spires. Luna's wet foot showed signs of frostbite, but she refused to stop until they had put miles between themselves and pursuit. When they found shelter in a shallow cave, Caleb insisted on examining her foot by candlelight. The toes were white and numb, clear signs of early frostbite that required immediate treatment. This is going to hurt, he warned, beginning to massage, feeling back into the affected areas. Luna bit her lip to keep from crying out as circulation returned with agonizing pins and needles. The treatment was necessary but painful, requiring constant attention to prevent tissue damage. Thank you, she gasped when the worst pain had passed. Don't thank me yet. We have to keep that foot warm and dry for days while traveling through snow. Luna smiled despite their circumstances. I'm beginning to understand why Apache people valued wolves. They take care of their pack members, even when it's difficult. As they settled down to wait for dawn, sharing body heat in the cramped cave, Caleb found himself thinking about Luna's suggestion that Sarah and Grace might still be alive. The possibility seemed impossible, but it had planted a seed of hope he couldn't quite extinguish. Perhaps it was time to consider that the story he had told himself for 12 years wasn't the only explanation. Perhaps there were other truths waiting to be discovered, other possibilities he had been too wounded to consider. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating, opening doors he had sealed shut. But with Luna beside him, sharing warmth in the darkness, he found courage to imagine that second chances might be possible even for a man who had given up on hope years ago. Dawn came gray and cold, with clouds promising more snow. Luna's foot had responded well to treatment, showing pink color instead of dangerous white, but she would need to be careful about keeping it warm during the day's travel. They had climbed high enough that terrain below was visible for miles. The canyon where they had eluded pursuers wound toward lower elevations like a dark scar, while ahead the route to Eagle Rock continued through dramatic mountain scenery. "Can you see them?" Caleb asked, studying distant terrain through his spyglass. Luna pointed to thin smoke rising from the canyon floor several miles behind. "There, they made camp where we lost them, probably waiting for daylight to pick up our trail." "How good are they at tracking?" "Good enough." "That smoke is from Jenkins, Blackwood's best tracker. He's part Ute Indian, knows these mountains almost as well as Apache scouts." Luna gathered her gear. "He'll find our trail eventually, but the rocky ground will slow him down." They set off across a high plateau that stretched between towering peaks, following a route that Luna's grandfather had marked with symbols indicating safe passage through avalanche zones and hidden crevasses. The elevation meant every breath required conscious effort. As they walked, Luna continued instruction in survival skills, pointing out landmarks for navigation and explaining how her ancestors had traveled these routes for generations without maps, relying instead on knowledge passed down through families. "Your grandfather made this journey?" Caleb asked during a rest beside a wind-carved stone formation. "Many times. He was one of the guardians of the sacred valley, responsible for ensuring only appropriate people visited the healing springs." Luna traced a symbol on the map. "This mark means test of character. There are places where travelers must prove their worthiness, or the mountains will turn them back." "What kind of test?" "Different things for different people. Sometimes physical courage, like crossing a narrow bridge. Sometimes spiritual discipline, like fasting at sacred sites." Luna folded the map. "Sometimes simply the willingness to turn back when spirits indicate you're not meant to proceed." Caleb wondered what kind of test might await them, whether a man who had lost his faith would be able to pass trials designed for believers. His doubts were interrupted by Luna's sharp intake of breath. "What is it?" he asked, following her gaze across the plateau. "Eagle," Luna whispered, pointing to a golden shape circling overhead, but not hunting, watching. Caleb studied the bird through his spyglass, noting the deliberate pattern of its flight and the way it seemed to follow their progress. In all his mountain years, he had never seen an eagle behave quite this way. "Your grandmother would have called it a spirit guide," he said. "My grandmother would have been right." Luna's voice held wonder. "Eagles don't follow people unless there's a reason." As if responding to her words, the eagle cried once and began flying in a specific direction, away from their planned route toward rock formations not marked on the map. It circled the area 3 times, then landed on a prominent outcropping, clearly visible against the gray sky. "It wants us to follow," Luna said with conviction. Caleb's practical nature rebelled against changing their route based on bird behavior, but he had learned to trust Luna's mountain knowledge. "How far off course?" "Maybe a mile. We could reach the rocks, see what the eagle is showing us, and still reach Eagle Rock before sunset." They changed direction, following a game trail toward the formations where the eagle waited. As they drew closer, Caleb began understanding why the bird might have guided them here. The rocks formed a natural fortress with clear views and multiple escape routes, difficult for mounted pursuers to follow. More importantly, the area showed signs of recent human activity. Boot prints in snow, remains of a concealed campfire, and horse droppings indicating someone had spent considerable time here within the last few days. "Jenkins," Luna said grimly, studying the tracks. "He's been using this as a base camp. He knows we're heading for Eagle Rock, so he's positioning himself to intercept us." Caleb examined the evidence, noting details that spoke of military planning rather than random pursuit. "This isn't just tracking anymore. This is an ambush." The realization changed everything. Instead of being hunted, trying to stay ahead of pursuers, they were walking into a prepared trap set by someone who knew the terrain and had anticipated their route. How many men, Caleb asked. At least 4, maybe more. Fresh horses, military equipment, supplies for an extended operation. Luna's expression grew troubled. Blackwood isn't sending trackers anymore. He's mounting a full military expedition. The eagle cried again, then took flight and began circling an area about a quarter-mile away. Both felt compelled to follow its guidance, making their way carefully through rock formations toward whatever the bird was trying to show them. What they found was a hidden cache of supplies, concealed beneath stones that looked natural, but had clearly been arranged by human hands. Inside were provisions, ammunition, and most importantly, a detailed map showing locations of multiple ambush sites between their current position and Eagle Rock. Jenkins isn't just tracking us, Caleb said, studying military-style notations. He's herding us toward a killing ground where Blackwood's men can finish us without witnesses. Luna examined other contents, finding items that confirmed her worst fears. Look at this, she said, holding up wanted posters with their descriptions and substantial bounties for their capture, dead or alive. The posters revealed that Blackwood had connections far beyond what either had realized. Official stamps from territorial authorities, signatures from federal marshals, legal language that made their pursuit appear legitimate rather than personal vendetta. We're not just running from mining company thugs, Luna said with growing alarm. Blackwood has convinced the territorial government that we're dangerous criminals. Caleb studied the documents, noting details suggesting extensive planning and political influence. This cache wasn't set up yesterday. Someone's been preparing for weeks. The implications were staggering. Blackwood had somehow anticipated their flight to the Sacred Valley and had prepared multiple contingencies to ensure their capture. The man was operating on a completely different level, with resources and connections that made their survival chances increasingly slim. The Eagle, Luna said suddenly, it led us here for a reason, not just to warn us about the ambush, but to give us intelligence we need to avoid it. She had a point. Without the bird's guidance, they would have walked blindly into Jenkins's trap. The cache provided detailed information about enemy positions and planned ambush sites that would allow them to choose an alternate route. Can we reach the Sacred Valley without going through Eagle Rock? Caleb asked. Luna consulted her grandfather's map, comparing it with tactical information they had discovered. There's an older route, much more difficult and dangerous. It goes through high passes where avalanches are common, crosses glacial streams that might not be frozen. But it would avoid Jenkins and his men. Probably. The terrain is too dangerous for horses, and most white men wouldn't attempt it even with guides. Luna looked up at the circling eagle. My grandfather called it the spirit path, reserved for emergencies when the normal route was blocked. Caleb made the decision quickly. We take the spirit path. Better to risk avalanches than walk into a military ambush. They gathered additional supplies from the cache, taking only what they could carry without being slowed by excess weight. As they prepared to leave, the eagle took flight once more, crying out as it began flying toward the high peaks that marked the beginning of the dangerous alternate route. Thank you, Luna said softly, addressing the bird as if it could understand, for the warning, for the guidance, for watching over travelers who need protection. The eagle circled once more, then disappeared into gray clouds gathering around the highest peaks. Snow was coming again, which would make their journey more difficult, but would also help conceal their tracks from Jenkins and his hunting party. As they began climbing toward the spirit path, Caleb found himself thinking about the morning's events with wonder and skepticism. The rational part of his mind insisted that discovering the cache had been pure coincidence, that the eagle's behavior could be explained by natural causes. But another part of him, a part he had thought dead for 12 years, wondered if Luna might be right about spiritual guidance. The timing had been too perfect, the eagle's behavior too specific, the outcome too favorable for pure chance. Perhaps there were powers at work in these mountains that cared about justice and protection of sacred places. Perhaps Sarah and Grace, if they were still alive somewhere, were being watched over by the same mysterious forces that had guided an eagle to save 2 desperate fugitives. The thought gave him comfort as they climbed toward treacherous high passes, following a route that would test every survival skill while offering slim hope of reaching sanctuary in the legendary Valley of Souls. The spirit path proved everything Luna had warned and more. For 2 days, they climbed through terrain that challenged even their considerable mountain experience, crossing narrow ridges where a misstep would result in a 1,000-foot fall, and navigating areas where recent avalanches had left snow unstable. The route took them above the tree line, through a landscape of bare rock and ice, where the only shelter came from occasional overhangs that provided minimal protection from constant wind. The air was so thin that every movement required conscious effort, and cold was intense enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Luna's knowledge of the ancient path proved invaluable as she guided them around hidden crevasses and through passages that would have been impossible to find without her grandfather's map. But even her expertise couldn't entirely protect them from the dangers of high-altitude winter travel. On the second day, as they descended from the highest pass toward more sheltered terrain, they encountered another traveler coming up the path from the opposite direction. An Apache man, perhaps 50 years old, with the weathered face and careful movements of someone accustomed to solitary mountain travel. Luna's gasp of recognition echoed off the surrounding peaks. "Uncle Joseph," she called out in Apache, her voice thick with emotion. The man's response was equally heartfelt, and they spoke rapidly in their native tongue while Caleb watched the reunion with interest. Uncle Joseph's presence on this remote path was clearly unexpected, and from Luna's expressions, the news he brought was both welcome and troubling. "This is my father's brother," Luna explained when the conversation had subsided. "Joseph Crow Feather. Uncle, this is Caleb Stone, the man who helped me escape from Blackwood's killers." Joseph studied Caleb with dark eyes that seemed to measure every detail of his character. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear. "You are the mountain man who killed Morrison and his companions," he said without judgment, but with obvious awareness of recent events. "Word travels fast," Caleb replied. "Blackwood has put a price on your heads. $5,000 for the woman, $3,000 for you. Every bounty hunter between here and Denver is looking for easy money." Luna asked a question in Apache, and Joseph's response made her face go pale. She translated with a trembling voice. "Uncle Joseph has news about Tommy. Blackwood isn't just keeping him as a ward anymore. He's preparing to leave the territory entirely, taking Tommy to California where he has mining interests." "When?" Caleb asked, understanding immediately why this changed everything. Joseph answered in English. 3 days, maybe 4. Blackwood received word that federal marshals are investigating his land claims. He's liquidating his Colorado operations before the law catches up. The revelation forced them to reconsider their entire strategy. If they continued to the Sacred Valley, they might find sanctuary, but Tommy would be lost forever in California's vastness. If they attempted a rescue against a fortified compound, they would probably die trying. "How many men does Blackwood have at the fort?" Caleb asked. 20, maybe 25. Professional gunmen, not miners. The boy is kept in the central compound, always under guard. Luna closed her eyes, struggling between maternal love and practical wisdom. "We can't assault a fortified position with just 3 people." "Maybe we don't assault it," Caleb said slowly, an idea forming. "Maybe we let them come to us." He outlined his plan as they took shelter in a wind-carved cave. The strategy was dangerous and required precise timing, but it offered their only realistic chance of rescuing Tommy while avoiding suicidal direct attack. "Blackwood has to move his operation through Devil's Canyon to reach the main trail to California," Caleb explained. "It's the only route that can handle heavy wagons. If we position ourselves correctly, we can create an ambush that separates Tommy from his guards without fighting the entire force." Joseph nodded thoughtfully. "The canyon narrows to a single passage halfway through. Good place for a rock slide that could block the trail and divide their column." "Exactly. We trigger the slide after Tommy's wagon passes, but before the main body of guards can follow. That leaves us facing only his immediate escort instead of 25 armed men." Luna studied the tactical situation, looking for flaws that could get them killed. What if Tommy doesn't want to be rescued? What if Blackwood has convinced him that we're dangerous? It was a valid concern that could turn their rescue mission into tragedy if the boy fought against his would-be saviors. 3 years of psychological manipulation would be difficult to overcome during the chaos of an ambush. We'll deal with that when it happens, Caleb said, but we can't leave him with Blackwood. Joseph offered additional intelligence that shaped their planning. There's a Ute trading camp 2 days south of Devil's Canyon. Friends who might provide fresh horses if we can reach them after the rescue. And if we can't, then we make our way to the Sacred Valley on foot, with Blackwood's entire force pursuing us. Joseph's smile was grim but determined. It's been many years since I've had an adventure worthy of the old stories. They spent the rest of the day refining their plan, using Joseph's knowledge of Devil's Canyon terrain to identify the best positions for ambush and likely escape routes if things went wrong. The strategy required them to split up, with each person taking responsibility for a different aspect of the operation. Luna would position herself at the canyon's narrow point, ready to trigger the rock slide using dynamite that Joseph had cached for mining purposes. Caleb would neutralize Tommy's immediate guards once the boy was separated from the main force. Joseph would handle their retreat, ensuring horses were waiting for high-speed escape. The plan had numerous weaknesses and depended heavily on timing, luck, and their ability to adapt when something inevitably went wrong. But it was their only realistic option for saving Tommy from a life of exile and psychological manipulation. As they prepared to descend from the high country toward Devil's Canyon, Luna performed one final ceremony with sage and tobacco, offering prayers for the mission's success and her son's safety. This time, Caleb found himself silently adding his own requests to whatever powers might be listening. The eagle had not appeared since guiding them away from Jenkins's ambush, but as they began their descent, Luna spotted a golden shape circling high overhead. The bird cried once, a wild sound that echoed off surrounding peaks, then flew in the direction they needed to travel. "Good omen," Joseph said with satisfaction. "The spirits approve of our mission." Caleb was no longer certain whether he believed in spirit guides, but he had learned to appreciate their psychological value. Whether the eagle's appearance was supernatural guidance or simple coincidence, it gave them confidence as they prepared for what might be their final confrontation with the man who had caused them all so much pain. The stakes were clear. Success would mean rescuing Tommy and perhaps finding their way to the Sacred Valley Sanctuary. Failure would mean death for all of them and permanent loss of everything they had fought to protect. As they descended toward Devil's Canyon, following game trails through increasingly familiar terrain, each carried the weight of impossible hopes and desperate determination. The next few days would determine whether justice was possible in a world where money and violence often prevailed over love and honor. Behind them, the high peaks disappeared into gathering clouds that promised more snow. Ahead lay the dangerous route to Devil's Canyon, where they would either save a lost boy or die in the attempt to reunite a family torn apart by greed and violence. The mountain silence was broken only by wind through pine trees and the soft sound of snowshoes crunching across frozen landscape, carrying three people toward a confrontation that would define the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might prove to be. The descent from the spirit path brought them into terrain carved from dreams and nightmares, impossible beauty mixed with deadly danger. Devil's Canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, its walls rising sheer for hundreds of feet, leaving only a narrow passage where the old freight road wound between towering stone ramparts. This was the choke point where Blackwood's wagon train would have to pass, where three desperate people would attempt to snatch a child from 25 armed men. Joseph Crowfeather had not exaggerated the tactical advantages. The canyon walls provided natural cover for anyone positioned above the road, while the narrow passage meant a well-placed rock slide could split a column in half. But the same features that made it perfect for an ambush also made it a death trap if their plan failed. There would be no retreat once the shooting started. Luna studied the terrain through Caleb's spyglass, marking positions where they would need to place themselves. Her grandfather's map showed that this canyon had been used by Apache war parties for generations, a place where the mountain spirits were said to favor those who fought for just causes. "The dynamite charges need to go there," she said, pointing to loose boulders halfway up the eastern wall. "When they fall, they'll block the road completely. But the timing has to be perfect." Caleb nodded, calculating angles and distances. "How long between the lead wagon passing and the main force reaching the narrows?" "Maybe 10 minutes if they're moving at normal speed. Less if they suspect trouble." Joseph had been studying the canyon with the eyes of a man who had fought many battles in similar terrain. When he spoke, his voice carried hard-earned wisdom. This place has seen much blood over the years. Apache, Mexican, American blood. If we spill more here today, it should be for something worthy of the sacrifice. Luna looked at her uncle with sudden understanding. You think we're going to die here? I think we're three people preparing to fight 25 professional killers for one child. But mathematics don't account for the power of love or the intervention of spirits who favor justice over gold. As they made final preparations, Luna performed a ceremony more elaborate than any Caleb had witnessed. She used sage, sweet grass, and tobacco, creating smoke that hung in the still air longer than wind patterns would explain. Her chanted prayers were in pure Apache, but even without understanding the words, Caleb could feel their power and intensity. When she finished, she looked directly at him. I asked the mountain spirits to protect all of us, but especially to watch over Tommy when the violence begins. A child shouldn't witness more death. What if he doesn't recognize you? Caleb asked gently. 3 years is a long time. Blackwood may have convinced him that his mother abandoned him. The question struck at Luna's deepest fear, but she faced it with courage. Then I'll prove that love is stronger than lies, that blood calls to blood, no matter how much poison has been poured between. The sound they had been waiting for came just after noon, distant rumble of heavy wagons and clip-clop of many horses echoing off canyon walls. Blackwood's expedition was moving faster than expected, probably hoping to clear the dangerous passage before ambushers could set up positions. Luna scrambled up the eastern wall to her position near the dynamite charges. Joseph disappeared into boulders on the western side, where he could provide covering fire. Caleb took position behind a massive fallen stone that would give him clear view of the road while providing protection. The first riders came into view around the canyon's bend, and Caleb felt his blood run cold. These were not rough miners, but professional cavalry soldiers in blue uniforms. Blackwood had convinced the U.S. Army to provide escort, lending official legitimacy to what should have been criminal flight from justice. Cavalry, he called softly to Luna. At least a dozen soldiers, maybe more. Luna's response drifted down from above. I see them. Uncle Joseph was right about this being worthy of sacrifice. The lead wagon appeared next, and Caleb's heart clenched at what he saw. Tommy Nightfeather sat on the driver's bench beside Colonel Blackwood himself, the boy's face turned up toward the man with obvious affection and trust. The psychological manipulation had been devastatingly effective. Tommy looked at Blackwood the way a son should look at a beloved father. Behind them came a column of heavy wagons loaded with mining equipment and strong boxes that probably contained gold. More cavalry rode alongside, weapons ready, eyes scanning canyon walls for signs of ambush. Caleb counted 23 soldiers plus Blackwood and Tommy, impossible odds under any circumstances. But the plan wasn't to fight all of them at once. The plan was to separate Tommy from his protectors and escape in the confusion. The lead wagon reached the narrow passage where Luna waited with her hand on the dynamite plunger. Too early, and the explosion would kill Tommy. Too late, and all their enemies would be through the choke point. Luna's timing was perfect. The lead wagon cleared the danger zone by 50 yards before she triggered the charges, bringing down tons of rock that completely blocked the passage. The thunderous roar echoed off canyon walls, sending loose stones raining down and causing horses to rear in terror. Colonel Blackwood's wagon was now isolated with only 4 cavalry guards for protection, while the main body of soldiers was trapped on the wrong side of tons of stone. But instead of panicking, Blackwood demonstrated why he had survived so long. His response was immediate and decisive. Defensive positions, he bellowed, drawing his sidearm as he leaped from the wagon. Cover the boom. The 4 soldiers reacted with professional discipline, forming a protective square around Tommy while seeking cover. It was textbook response to ambush, executed with precision of men trained for exactly this situation. Caleb's first shot took down one soldier before the man could find cover. His second shot went wide but forced the cavalry to keep their heads down. From across the canyon, Joseph's rifle began speaking at regular intervals, steady shots that kept soldiers pinned, while Caleb moved to a new position. Tommy's reaction was not what any of them had hoped. Instead of cowering or showing recognition when Luna called to him in Apache, the boy drew a small pistol and began looking for targets. Blackwood had not just psychologically manipulated the child. He had turned him into an active participant in his own captivity. "Tommy," Luna called out in English. "Tommy, it's your mother. I've come to take you home." The boy's response was a shot fired in her direction, the bullet striking stone close enough to shower her with fragments. His voice, when it came, was filled with hatred. "You're not my mother. You're a savage who wants to drag me back to living in dirt. Colonel Blackwood is my father now, and I'll kill anyone who tries to take me from him." Luna's anguished cry echoed off canyon walls, a sound of heartbreak so profound it momentarily stopped gunfire from both sides. For a mother to hear such words from the child she had risked everything to save was torture worse than any physical wound. But Caleb had no time to comfort her grief. One soldier had worked around the perimeter and was now in position to take a shot at Luna's exposed position. Caleb's rifle spoke again, spinning the man around and dropping him among the rocks. The engagement was developing into exactly the prolonged firefight they had hoped to avoid. Every minute trapped in the canyon was another minute for soldiers on the far side to find a way around the obstruction. Joseph seemed to recognize the deteriorating situation. His covering fire intensified, forcing remaining soldiers to keep their heads down while he began moving from position to position like a man 20 years younger. It was Tommy himself who broke the stalemate, though not in any way that brought comfort. The boy suddenly broke from cover and ran toward rocks where he could get a better angle on Luna's position, his small pistol ready to fire. Blackwood's shout of approval rang across the canyon, praising the child's courage while urging him to kill the woman who had given him birth. Luna could not bring herself to shoot her own son. Instead, she stepped out from cover with hands raised, offering herself as a target in hopes that seeing her face clearly might trigger buried memories. "Please, Tommy," she called out in Apache, then switched to English. "Look at me. Really look at me. Remember the stories I used to tell you about Rabbit and Coyote. Remember how you used to fall asleep in my arms while I sang the old songs." For a moment, uncertainty flickered across the boy's face. Some deep part of his memory stirred, responding to his mother's voice in fragments of a childhood that Blackwood's poison hadn't quite erased. His gun hand wavered, and his eyes showed confusion instead of hatred. But Blackwood was there instantly, placing a protective hand on the boy's shoulder while his voice dropped to the persuasive tone he had perfected over 3 years. "Don't listen to her lies, son. She abandoned you because Apache women don't love their children the way civilized people do. I saved you from that life, gave you education and proper food. She wants to drag you back to savagery." The moment of doubt passed, and Tommy's face hardened again. But Caleb had been watching Blackwood during this exchange, and what he saw gave him an idea born of desperation and long familiarity with evil men. "Blackwood," he called out, "you want to convince the boy that we're monsters? Then fight like a man instead of hiding behind children. Just you and me, pistols at 20 paces. Winner takes Tommy." The challenge was calculated to appeal to Blackwood's ego while exposing his cowardice. If he accepted, it would be a fair fight. If he refused, Tommy might wonder why his supposed father was afraid. Blackwood's response revealed everything about his character. "I don't duel with murderers and thieves. Tommy, kill that man. Show him what happens to anyone who threatens your real family." But something in Tommy's expression had changed. Perhaps it was seeing Blackwood order a child to commit murder, or perhaps finally recognizing something familiar in Luna's face. Whatever the cause, the boy lowered his pistol and stepped back, confusion replacing artificial hatred. I don't want to kill anyone," Tommy said quietly, uncertainty replacing the programmed responses. Blackwood's mask of paternal affection slipped for the first time, revealing cold calculation beneath. "You'll do as you're told, boy, or you'll learn what happens to ungrateful children who forget their obligations." The threat was exactly the wrong thing to say to a child already beginning to doubt. Tommy flinched as if struck, and his eyes went wide with fear that had nothing to do with the gunfight. Luna saw her opportunity and took it, speaking in the gentle tone she had once used for bedtime stories. "You don't have to hurt anyone, little one. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I'm here to take you somewhere safe, somewhere no one will force you to do things that feel wrong." The standoff was broken by the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the Sacred Valley direction. the drumming rhythm of many horses moving at speed across rocky ground. Both sides turned toward the sound, weapons ready for whatever new threat or salvation might be approaching. What emerged from the canyon's twists made Luna's heart leap with recognition. A war party of Apache warriors rode toward them with Chief Joseph Thunderheart at their head, his gray braids streaming as he guided his paint horse around scattered boulders with the skill of a man born in the saddle. Behind him came a dozen warriors in traditional dress, their faces painted for battle and weapons ready. But this was not a raiding party seeking conquest or revenge. These were defenders of the sacred valley, drawn by gunfire and knowledge that their daughter Luna was fighting for her life against impossible odds. Blackwood's remaining soldiers recognized immediately that their situation had become hopeless. 3 enemies had become 15, and the new arrivals had advantage of position, numbers, and intimate knowledge of terrain. Professional soldiers knew when to fight and when to surrender. "Stand down," the cavalry sergeant called to his men, raising his hands. "We're outnumbered and outgunned. No sense dying for one man's gold when the army won't acknowledge we were here." But Blackwood was far from ready to surrender. He grabbed Tommy and pressed a pistol to the boy's head, using the child as a human shield while he backed toward a narrow cleft that might provide escape. "Stay back, all of you," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "I'll kill the boy before I let you savages take him. He's mine. I made him into something better than Apache filth." Chief Thunderheart dismounted with the dignity of a man accustomed to command, walking forward until he was close enough to speak without shouting. When he broke his silence, his voice carried the authority of generations of leadership. "Release the child," he said simply, speaking in English so everyone could understand. "You have already lost this battle. Do not compound your crimes by harming an innocent boy." "He's not innocent," Blackwood screamed, the pistol trembling as stress overwhelmed his self-control. "I saved him from your primitive ways. I gave him civilization, education, a future. You want to drag him back to living in mud and worshiping false spirits." Chief Thunderheart's response was spoken with patient tone of an adult addressing a troubled child. "The boy can choose his own path when he is old enough to understand the choices. But first, he must live to reach that age." Luna had been creeping closer during the exchange, using the distraction to work her way around behind Blackwood's position. Now she was close enough to see Tommy's face clearly, close enough to read the terror and confusion in his eyes as he finally understood that the man he had been taught to trust was willing to kill him rather than lose possession of him. "Tommy," she called softly, speaking in Apache with all the love and tenderness she had stored up during 3 years of separation. "Do you remember the song I used to sing when storms frightened you? The one about the brave little rabbit who found his way home through the dark forest." The boy's eyes found hers across the rocky ground, and for the first time since the shooting began, she saw recognition rather than hatred in his gaze. The Apache words had triggered something deeper than Blackwood's conditioning, some fundamental memory of safety and love that no amount of psychological manipulation could completely erase. "Mama?" Tommy whispered, the words so quiet it was almost lost in the mountain wind. But Luna heard it, and her heart soared even as tears streamed down her face. Blackwood felt the boy's sudden shift in allegiance and pressed the pistol harder against Tommy's temple. "Shut up! Don't listen to her lies. I'm your father now. I'm the one who fed you and clothed you and taught you to read." But Tommy was no longer listening to the man who had stolen 3 years of his childhood. His eyes were locked on his mother's face, and buried memories were surfacing faster than Blackwood could suppress them. The sound of Apache lullabies, the smell of sage smoke, the feeling of absolute safety that came from being held in arms that loved him without reservation. "You're not my father," Tommy said with growing confidence. "My father was killed by your men. You took me away from my real family and filled my head with lies about them being bad people." Blackwood's response was to cock the hammer on his pistol, the metallic click echoing like a death sentence. "Then you can join your savage family in the afterlife." But before he could pull the trigger, Joseph Crowfeather's rifle spoke from the rocks above. The bullet took Blackwood in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing his shot to go wild, striking stone instead of flesh. Tommy broke free and ran toward Luna, who caught him in her arms and held him tight, while Apache warriors swarmed over Blackwood's position. The reunion between mother and child was everything Luna had dreamed of during long months of separation, but it was also more complex than she had hoped. Tommy clung to her with desperate need, but his body trembled with confusion and fear as he struggled to reconcile 3 years of conditioning with the evidence of his own senses. "I'm sorry, Mama," he whispered against her shoulder. "I said terrible things to you. I tried to shoot you. He told me you were evil, that you didn't love me anymore." "Shh, little one," Luna murmured, stroking his hair and rocking him gently. "None of that was your fault. You were just a little pea trying to survive in a world that had gone crazy. The only thing that matters now is that we're together again." Chief Thunderheart approached the reunited family with measured steps of a man who understood the delicacy of the moment. Tommy looked up at his grandfather with wide eyes, recognition stirring as he studied the weathered face and traditional dress. "Grandfather?" Tommy asked hesitantly, using the Apache word he had not spoken in 3 years. "Yes, grandson," Chief Thunderheart replied in the same language, his voice thick with emotion. "I am here. We are all here. You are safe now, and you will never be taken from your family again." But their celebration was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching from the direction the cavalry had originally come. The main body of soldiers had found a way around the rock slide and was now approaching at full gallop, sabers drawn and intentions clearly hostile. "More soldiers," Caleb warned, taking position with his rifle ready. "At least 20 men, coming fast." Chief Thunderheart rose with dignity of a man who had faced greater odds before. But as the cavalry came into view, something unexpected happened that changed the nature of the confrontation entirely. The lead rider was not a cavalry officer, but a man in civilian clothes wearing a federal marshal's badge, his authority clearly recognized by the soldiers who rode behind him. When he reached the scene, he dismounted and surveyed the situation with practiced eye of someone accustomed to sorting truth from lies. "I'm Federal Marshal Daniel Rivers," he announced to the assembled group. "I have warrants for the arrest of Wade Blackwood on charges of land fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit murder. I also have custody orders for the child known as Thomas Nightfeather to be returned to his legal guardian." He looked directly at Luna. "That would be you, Mrs. Nightfeather. The territorial courts have ruled that your son was illegally taken and that you are his rightful guardian." The revelation struck everyone like a thunderbolt. Blackwood, clutching his wounded shoulder and sitting propped against the boulder, stared at the marshal with disbelief and growing rage. "That's impossible," he snarled. "I have legal custody of the boy. I filed all the proper papers." Marshal Rivers smiled grimly. "You filed forged papers with clerks you had bribed. The federal government has been investigating your operation for 18 months. We know about the illegal land seizures, the murders disguised as Apache raids, the systematic theft of tribal resources." He gestured toward the wounded man. "Wade Blackwood, you're under arrest for violations of federal law and territorial statute. Your property will be seized and your illegal mining operations shut down permanently." Caleb stepped forward, still hardly believing what he was hearing. "What about the bounties on our heads? The wanted posters claiming we're dangerous criminals? Also forged, using stolen official seals and signatures. You're not wanted for any crimes, Mr. Stone. In fact, the territorial governor would like to thank you for your assistance in bringing Blackwood to justice." The marshal's words began transforming what had seemed like hopeless flight from overwhelming forces into something approaching vindication and justice. But Luna was focused on more immediate concerns than legal technicalities. "Tommy will need time to recover from what was done to him," she said firmly. "He's been psychologically manipulated for 3 years, turned against his own heritage. Healing from that kind of damage takes more than legal papers." Chief Thunderheart nodded agreement. "The boy should come to the Sacred Valley, where our medicine men can help cleanse the poison from his mind and heart. The healing waters and traditional ceremonies will restore his connection to his people and his true self." Marshal Rivers considered this request with understanding of a man who had seen too many children damaged by adult conflicts. "The law requires that Tommy be returned to his mother's custody, but it doesn't specify where that custody must be exercised. As long as Mrs. Nightfeather remains his guardian, I see no legal obstacle to him receiving whatever treatment she deems appropriate. The journey to the Sacred Valley took 2 days, moving at a pace that allowed Tommy to gradually adjust to being surrounded by Apache warriors and traditional customs he had been taught to fear. Chief Thunderheart proved remarkably patient with his grandson's confusion, answering questions about Apache ways while never pushing the boy to accept or reject what he learned. Luna watched her son's slow transformation with hope and heartbreak. Tommy was clearly struggling to reconcile 3 years of conditioning with evidence of his own senses, and the process was often painful to witness. But gradually, as they traveled deeper into the sacred mountains, she began seeing glimpses of the curious, brave child she remembered. Caleb found himself thinking about Luna's earlier suggestion that Sarah and Grace might still be alive somewhere, perhaps living among Apache people who had saved them from the massacre he thought he had witnessed. The possibility seemed less impossible now that he had seen how completely Tommy's memories had been manipulated. If his family had survived, if they had been rescued by someone like Chief Thunderheart, they might have spent 12 years believing their husband and father was dead. The thought was both torturous and exhilarating, opening possibilities he had never dared imagine. The Sacred Valley revealed itself gradually as they climbed higher, first as a distant glimpse of green among snow-covered peaks, then as a hidden paradise that seemed to exist outside normal rules of geography and climate. The entrance was marked by 3 massive stone monoliths that rose like sentinels, their surfaces covered with Apache pictographs telling the history of generations of guardians. But it was the valley itself that took Caleb's breath away. Sheltered by high peaks and warmed by hot springs that bubbled up from deep underground, it supported a microclimate that allowed grass and flowers to grow even in winter. Crystal-clear streams wound between meadows where deer grazed without fear, and the air itself seemed cleaner and more refreshing than anywhere else he had ever been. "This is what Blackwood wanted to destroy," Luna said quietly as they rode through the valley's heart toward the Apache settlement built around the largest hot springs. He would have turned this into a commercial operation, bottled the sacred waters, and sold them to the highest bidder. Chief Thunderheart heard her words and nodded gravely. There have always been men who see the sacred as merely valuable, who would destroy beauty to create profit. But the valley protects itself. Those who come with greed in their hearts find only disappointment and danger. The Apache settlement was unlike any community Caleb had ever encountered. Traditional Vikingos stood alongside more permanent structures, and people moved with serenity that spoke of lives lived in harmony with their environment. Children played freely among hot springs, elderly people sat in quiet contemplation, and everyone seemed to radiate the peace that came from knowing they were exactly where they belonged. Luna's homecoming was celebrated with a feast that lasted into the night, but it was also marked by ceremonies designed to help Tommy begin reconnecting with his Apache heritage. The medicine man, an ancient figure whose exact age no one seemed to know, conducted rituals intended to cleanse the psychological poison Blackwood had planted. "Healing of the mind and spirit takes time," the medicine man explained to Luna. In Apache, his words translated by Chief Thunderheart, "The boy has been taught to hate himself, to see his own blood as something shameful. Such wounds run deep, but they can be healed with patience and love." Tommy participated in the ceremonies with growing enthusiasm, clearly drawn to the sense of acceptance and belonging that surrounded him. But he also sought out Caleb's company during quiet moments, perhaps recognizing someone else who was struggling to find his place in this new world. "Are you going to stay here?" Tommy asked one evening as they sat by one of the smaller hot springs, watching steam rise into the star-filled sky. Caleb considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet. This place is beautiful, and your grandfather has made me welcome, but I'm still searching for something I lost a long time ago." "Your family? Mama told me they might still be alive." "Maybe, or maybe I just need to learn how to let them go and build something new." Caleb looked at the boy's earnest face in the firelight. "What about you? Are you happy to be back with your mother and your people?" Tommy was quiet for a moment, clearly thinking seriously. "I'm happy to be with Mama again. I missed her more than I let myself remember. But some of the things Colonel Blackwood taught me, they weren't all lies. He did give me an education, taught me to read and write and understand mathematics." "Knowledge is never a bad thing," Caleb agreed. "The problem comes when people try to convince you that learning new ways means you have to reject the old ones." Their conversation was interrupted by Luna's approach, her footsteps soft on the mineral-stained rocks around the hot spring. She settled beside them with natural grace, and for a moment they sat in comfortable silence. "Chief Thunderheart wants to speak with you," Luna said to Caleb. "He has something to tell you about your family." Caleb's heart began to race. What kind of something? He wouldn't say, just that there are things you need to know, stories that might help you understand what really happened 12 years ago. The conversation with Chief Thunderheart took place in the Elders' private lodge, a structure that combined traditional Apache architecture with practical adaptations for mountain living. The walls were lined with weapons, ceremonial objects, and artifacts that spoke of a life dedicated to protecting his people in their sacred places. "Sit, my friend," the chief said, gesturing to a spot near the central fire. "We have much to discuss, and some of it may be difficult to hear." Caleb settled cross-legged on a woven mat, noting how naturally the posture came to him now after weeks of adapting to Apache customs. Chief Thunderheart took his time preparing sacred tobacco for smoking, using the ritual to create proper atmosphere for important conversation. "You knew my brother Joseph in the old days," the chief began, referring to Joseph Crowfeather. "He served as a scout for the army trying to keep peace between our peoples. But there were others who preferred war, who saw profit in conflict and death." "Blackwood," Caleb said. "Blackwood and men like him. They arranged for raids to be blamed on Apache warriors, killed our people, and took our children to justify seizure of our lands. But they also killed white settlers when it served their purposes, making it look like Apache work to inflame hatred between our peoples." Chief Thunderheart drew slowly on the pipe, letting the implications sink in before continuing. 12 years ago, my brother was scouting for a patrol that was supposed to protect a small settlement where some army families were staying. But when they arrived, they found the place already under attack." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "The settlement where my family died." "The settlement where your family was supposed to die," the chief corrected gently. "But my brother recognized that this was not a real Apache raid. The attackers were white men dressed as Indians, led by Blackwood's men. Joseph managed to save some of the people before the buildings were burned." The words hit Caleb like physical blows, each revelation reshaping everything he thought he knew about that terrible night. You're saying Sarah and Grace." "I'm saying they were among those my brother saved, along with several other women and children who were supposed to die that night to make Blackwood's false raid appear more convincing." The lodge seemed to spin around Caleb as the full implications became clear. For 12 years, he had mourned a family that was not dead, had built his entire identity around a loss that had never happened. The bodies he had found and buried had been strangers, other victims whose deaths had provided cover for the salvation of his loved ones. "Where are they now?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Chief Thunderheart's expression grew complicated. "That is more difficult to answer. Joseph brought them here to the sacred valley, where they lived safely for several years. Your wife learned our ways, became a healer among our people. Your daughter grew into a young woman of great beauty and intelligence. But they never stopped hoping you would find them, never stopped believing you might still be alive somewhere. 3 years ago, when Tommy was taken and Luna disappeared, Sarah insisted on going to search for any trace of their daughter. She and Grace left the valley against my advice, and we have not heard from them since." The revelation was almost too much to process. Sarah and Grace were alive, or at least had been 3 years ago. But now they were somewhere in the vast wilderness, perhaps facing the same dangers that had nearly claimed Luna and Tommy. "I have to find them," Caleb said, starting to rise. Chief Thunderheart placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Peace, my friend. There is more you must know before you begin another search." The chief reached into a wooden chest and withdrew a familiar object that made Caleb's breath catch. Sarah's silver locket, the one he had given her on their wedding day, lay in the old man's weathered palm like a piece of his own heart. Joseph found this in a trading post near Denver 6 months ago. The trader said it had been brought in by two women traveling alone, a white woman and a young lady of mixed heritage who spoke fluent Apache. They traded it for horses and supplies, saying they were going to search for someone very important to them. Caleb took the locket with trembling hands, opening it to reveal the miniature portrait of himself that Sarah had always carried. Seeing his own young, hopeful face looking back from the painted ivory was like encountering a ghost of the man he used to be. Going, "They're looking for me," he realized. "Just as I thought I was mourning them, they've been searching the territory trying to find any trace of me." It would seem so, and if they're following the same kind of trails that brought you to us, there's a good chance their search will eventually lead them here. The possibility filled Caleb with hope so intense it was almost painful. After 12 years of believing himself alone, he might be only days or weeks away from a reunion that would restore everything he had lost. As if summoned by their conversation about patience and faith, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed across the sacred valley, the rhythm suggesting riders familiar with the terrain and comfortable with their surroundings. Chief Thunderheart rose with dignity of a man accustomed to receiving important visitors, and Luna went to the lodge entrance to see who was approaching. Her gasp of recognition carried clearly in the mountain air. "It's them," she called back to the men inside. "Two women on horseback, approaching from the eastern trail. One of them matches the description of your wife." Caleb's heart began to pound so hard he could hear it in his ears. After 12 years of grief and loneliness, after abandoning hope and learning to live with emptiness, he was moments away from discovering whether the most important chapter of his life was ending or beginning. He stepped outside the lodge and looked across the meadow toward the approaching riders. And even at a distance, he knew beyond doubt that his long ordeal was finally over. The way Sarah sat her horse, the particular angle of her head as she scanned the Apache settlement, the cautious but determined manner of her approach, all of it was exactly as he remembered. Beside her rode a young woman who could only be Grace, no longer the 4-year-old child he remembered, but a beautiful teenager who had inherited the best features from both parents. She moved with confidence of someone raised among Apache people, comfortable in the saddle and alert to her surroundings without appearing fearful. As Caleb walked across the meadow toward the most important reunion of his life, Chief Thunderheart and Luna watched from the lodge entrance. Two people who understood that some moments were too significant for ordinary observation. The reunion itself was too private for others to witness closely, but across the sacred valley, the sound of Sarah's cry of recognition echoed off the surrounding peaks like a song of pure joy. The careful distance that Caleb and Sarah maintained as they first approached each other dissolved instantly when they were close enough to see each other's faces clearly, and suddenly they were holding each other with the desperate intensity of people who had been given up for dead. Grace's approach was more tentative, studying the man who had been her father but was now a stranger, changed by 12 years of believing himself alone. But when Caleb knelt and opened his arms to her, muscle memory and love proved stronger than time and uncertainty. She ran to him with all the enthusiasm of the little girl she had once been, and for several minutes the reunited family simply held each other and cried. 6 months later, the Sacred Valley had become home to an unlikely community that would have been impossible to imagine during Blackwood's reign of terror. The community had grown to include new lodges for the Stone family, who had chosen to divide their time between the valley and the outside world, carrying knowledge and understanding between two cultures that had too often been at war. Caleb had accepted a position as official liaison between the Apache people and the territorial government, using his unique perspective to help prevent the misunderstandings that had led to so much suffering. Sarah had become a teacher in the Valley School, sharing her knowledge while learning traditional Apache healing methods from the medicine men. Grace, now 17 and poised on the edge of womanhood, had emerged as a natural bridge between worlds, equally comfortable with Apache traditions and broader American culture. She served as a translator and cultural interpreter, helping visitors understand the significance of what they were experiencing. Luna and Tommy had found their own path to healing, building a new cabin near the hot springs where the boy could continue his recovery while his mother established herself as one of the valley's most skilled healers. Tommy's psychological wounds were still mending, but each month brought new progress in reclaiming his Apache identity while retaining the valuable knowledge Blackwood had taught him. The relationship between Caleb and Luna had evolved into something deeper than romance, but different from the passion that had defined his marriage with Sarah. They remained close friends and trusted allies, bound together by shared experiences that had changed both their lives fundamentally. Federal Marshal Daniel Rivers visited the Sacred Valley regularly, bringing news from the outside world and ensuring that legal protections for the area remained strong. Blackwood had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, his illegal mining operations permanently shut down, and his political connections exposed and discredited. But perhaps the most significant change was in Caleb himself. The bitter, isolated man who had once worked his forge through the night to escape his demons had been replaced by someone who understood that healing was possible, that second chances could be earned, and that hope was not a luxury, but a necessity for anyone who wanted to truly live. On a warm evening in late summer, as the family gathered around one of the hot springs for their weekly storytelling session, Grace asked a question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. "Father, do you ever regret the years we lost? Do you wish things had happened differently?" Caleb considered the question seriously, looking around at the faces of the people he loved most in the world. Sarah, still beautiful despite the lines that spoke of hard-won wisdom. Grace, growing into a remarkable woman who embodied the best of multiple cultures. Tommy, healing from his trauma with the resilience that characterized children who were truly loved. Luna, whose strength and faith had made all of this possible. "I regret the pain we all suffered," he said finally, "but I don't think I would change the journey that brought us here. We're not the same people we would have been if none of this had happened, and I think we're stronger for having survived it." He looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, remembering another night when he had sat by a different fire with very different company, planning a desperate rescue mission that had seemed doomed from the start. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are also the things that teach us who we really are and what really matters. I wouldn't trade these months in the Sacred Valley for anything, because they've shown me that home isn't just a place where you live. It's wherever the people you love are safe and happy. Luna smiled at his words, recognizing the profound change in the man who had once been consumed by grief and bitterness. "The Apache people have a saying," she added. "We are not just the sum of our joys or our sorrows, but the product of how we choose to weave them together into the story of our lives." As the evening progressed and the stories began in earnest, ranging from traditional Apache legends to tales of the adventures that had brought them all together, Caleb found himself thinking about the future with anticipation rather than dread. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. There would be difficult conversations with territorial officials, complex negotiations between cultures that still viewed each other with suspicion, and the ongoing work of building understanding where conflict had once seemed inevitable. But tonight, surrounded by family and friends, in a place where healing was not just possible but expected, Caleb Stone was exactly where he belonged. The long journey through grief and loss had finally led him home. In the distance, barely visible against the star-filled sky, a golden eagle circled once more over the Sacred Valley before disappearing into the vast darkness of the Colorado mountains, carrying with it the prayers and hopes of a community that had learned that love was indeed stronger than hatred, that understanding could overcome fear, and that even in the harshest wilderness, sanctuary could be found by those brave enough to seek it.